Israel, July 1970. The extradition hearing had lasted 6 hours. Meyer Lansky sat in a Tel Aviv courtroom, 68 years old, wearing modest gray suit that cost less than most men's watches. Outside, FBI agents waited with warrants for tax evasion, conspiracy, and racketeering. Inside, Israeli officials debated whether to send him back to America. What nobody in that courtroom understood was this: the quiet man in the cheap suit controlled more money than some small nations, and the FBI, despite 40 years of investigation, had never found where he kept it. When Lansky walked free that day, he left behind something unprecedented in criminal history. Not territory, not soldiers, not even a traditional organization. He left behind a financial system so sophisticated that American law enforcement spent the next decade trying to understand how it worked. Meyer Lansky had proven something that would reshape organized crime forever. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's a calculator. To understand what Lansky built, you need to understand America in 1946. The war was over. Soldiers were coming home with money to spend and trauma to forget. Cities were booming, suburbs were spreading, and for the first time in American history, working people had disposable income. They wanted entertainment, they wanted escape, they wanted to gamble. Gambling had always existed in America, but it was fragmented, local, controlled by dozens of small operators who fought over scraps. What didn't exist was infrastructure, banks that would handle gambling profits, accounting systems that could track millions in cash, investment networks that could fund casino construction. The Italian families controlled neighborhoods, the Irish controlled docks. The Jews, historically excluded from both territories, had learned something else: how to move money. Meyer Lansky was born Meyer Sucholyansky in Grodno, Russian Empire. His family immigrated to New York's Lower East Side when he was 9. By 14, he was running craps games. By 20, he understood something that would make him more powerful than any gangster. Mathematics doesn't lie. While other young criminals were learning to use guns, Lansky was learning percentages, house advantage, risk management. He discovered that violence was expensive and drew attention. Numbers were precise and invisible. In 1918, Lansky met Benjamin Siegel on the Lower East Side. Siegel was everything Lansky wasn't: flashy, violent, unpredictable. But Siegel had vision, and Lansky had skills to make vision profitable. Together, they built organized crime as business enterprise. Their first innovation was money flow. Traditional gambling operations took bets, paid winners, kept the rest. Simple, but limited. Lansky created something different: a banking system for illegal money. He established legitimate front businesses across New York: laundromats, restaurants, small manufacturing companies. Money from gambling operations would flow into these businesses, get cleaned through payroll and expenses, then emerge as taxable legitimate income. But Lansky went further. He created investment pools. Gambling profits from New York would fund operations in Florida. Florida profits would fund operations in Las Vegas. Las Vegas profits would fund operations in Cuba. Each operation appeared independent. Each generated legitimate income. Each cleaned money for the others. By 1940, Lansky controlled a financial network that stretched from Boston to Havana. He wasn't a crime boss. He was a bank that specialized in money other banks wouldn't touch. The Italian families noticed. Lucky Luciano called a meeting in 1946. The message was simple: we want in. Lansky's response changed everything. He didn't refuse. He didn't negotiate territory. He made them partners in something bigger than territory. He made them investors. Lansky offered the 5 families shares in a revolutionary project, a legitimate gambling destination in the American desert, a place where gambling would be legal, regulated, and profitable on a scale that illegal operations could never match. Las Vegas. The desert city had legalized gambling in 1931, but it remained a dusty frontier town with a few small casinos and cheap hotels. Lansky saw potential that others missed. He saw infrastructure, highways connecting California to the East Coast, aviation technology making travel faster, post-war prosperity creating a new class of tourists who could afford to lose money for entertainment. Most importantly, he saw government sanction. Legal gambling meant legal profits. Legal profits meant access to legitimate banking. Access to legitimate banking meant unlimited expansion. In 1946, Lansky sent Benjamin Siegel to Las Vegas with $6 million investment capital. The money came from the 5 families, from independent operators across the country, from Lansky's own accumulated profits. All of it pooled in a network of accounts that stretched from New York to Miami to offshore banks in Switzerland. The project was called the Flamingo Hotel and Casino. When it opened in December 1946, it represented something unprecedented, a criminal enterprise that operated entirely within legal boundaries. The Flamingo was more than a casino. It was a proof of concept. Lansky had demonstrated that organized crime could evolve beyond violence and territory into finance and investment. The profits were immediate and enormous. Within 6 months, the Flamingo was generating more money than most illegal operations in New York. But Siegel made a fatal error. He skimmed from the construction budget, inflated costs, and lied about profits. In June 1947, he was shot dead in his Beverly Hills mansion. Lansky's response revealed everything about how he operated. No revenge, no violence, no dramatic gestures. He simply removed Siegel's name from all financial records, redistributed his assets among other investors, and continued building. Within 2 years, Lansky controlled interests in 4 Las Vegas casinos. Within 5 years, he was the hidden partner in operations from Florida to Cuba to London. By 1955, he was what law enforcement would later call the banker of organized crime. His system worked like this. Any criminal organization that wanted to invest profits in legitimate businesses would bring their money to Lansky. He would identify opportunities, structure investments, manage risk, and distribute returns. His fee was typically 10% of profits, but his real power came from information. Lansky knew who had money, where it came from, and where it was going. He knew which operations were profitable and which were vulnerable. He knew which officials could be bought and which couldn't be touched. Knowledge made him more valuable than muscle, more secure than territory. But Lansky's greatest innovation wasn't in Las Vegas. It was in Cuba. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista seized control of Cuba in a military coup. Batista had a problem. Cuba's economy was stagnant, unemployment was high, and he needed foreign investment to maintain power. Lansky offered a solution: transform Cuba into the gambling capital of the Caribbean. The deal was elegant in its simplicity. Lansky would invest in Cuban casinos, hotels, and infrastructure. The Cuban government would legalize gambling, provide police protection, and take a percentage of profits. American tourists would fly to Havana for gambling, entertainment, and relaxation 90 miles from home. Within 5 years, Lansky controlled the Hotel Nacional, the Riviera, and half a dozen smaller operations in Havana. Cuban casinos were generating more profit than Las Vegas, and all of it was flowing through his financial network. But Cuba represented something more significant than profit. It was Lansky's demonstration that organized crime could transcend national boundaries, that financial networks could operate across governments and jurisdictions. By 1958, Lansky controlled what law enforcement estimates suggest was worth over $300 million in current assets. His network included operations in the United States, Cuba, Switzerland, and the Bahamas. He employed hundreds of people, most of whom didn't know they worked for him. He had investments in legitimate businesses across a dozen industries, and he accomplished all of this without ever being arrested for a serious crime. Then came January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro entered Havana with revolutionary forces. Batista fled to the Dominican Republic, and overnight, Meyer Lansky's empire collapsed. Castro's government seized all casino assets, froze bank accounts, and expelled American operators. Lansky lost an estimated $50 million in Cuba alone, but the real damage was systemic. The Cuban operations had been the center of his network, the hub through which money flowed between American operations and offshore accounts. For the first time in 40 years, Meyer Lansky was vulnerable. The IRS had been investigating Lansky since the 1940s, but they had never been able to prove substantial income because his money was constantly moving through legitimate businesses and foreign accounts. The Cuban collapse changed that calculation. Suddenly, Lansky needed to liquidate assets to cover losses. Liquidation created transaction records. Transaction records created evidence. In 1970, federal prosecutors indicted Lansky for tax evasion. The charges were specific: failure to report income from gambling operations between 1962 and 1968. The amount was relatively small by Lansky's standards, $300,000 in unreported income. But Lansky understood that the tax charges were just the beginning. If convicted, he would face additional indictments for conspiracy, racketeering, and money laundering. At age 68, any substantial prison sentence was effectively a life sentence. So Lansky did something that revealed the true extent of his network. He disappeared. Not into hiding, not into witness protection, into Israel, claiming citizenship under the law of return. Lansky argued that as a Jew, he had the right to Israeli citizenship, and as an Israeli citizen, he couldn't be extradited for political crimes. The legal battle lasted 2 years. American prosecutors argued that tax evasion wasn't a political crime. Israeli officials argued that Lansky was being persecuted for his ethnicity and associations rather than specific criminal acts. During those 2 years, something remarkable happened. The financial network that Lansky had built continued operating without him. Las Vegas casinos continued generating profits. Investment pools continued moving money between legitimate businesses. Offshore accounts continued accumulating interest. The system had become self-sustaining. In 1972, Israeli courts ruled that Lansky could be extradited. He returned to Miami, stood trial, and was acquitted on most charges. The few convictions resulted in minimal sentences. By 1974, he was free. But the game had changed. The Cuba collapse had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated financial networks were vulnerable to political upheaval. Federal law enforcement had developed new tools for tracking money movement, and most importantly, a new generation of criminals had learned from both Lansky's successes and his failures. Meyer Lansky died in Miami Beach in 1983, officially worth $57,000. The FBI spent months searching for missing millions, secret accounts, hidden assets they were certain existed. They never found them. What they did find was something more significant: a blueprint. Lansky had demonstrated that organized crime could operate as legitimate business, that violence was less effective than mathematics, that the most powerful criminal was the one who never appeared criminal at all. Modern organized crime, from Russian oligarchs to cartels to international money laundering, operates on principles that Meyer Lansky established: offshore banking, front businesses, investment diversification, political protection through economic leverage. The quiet man in the gray suit had built something more durable than territory, more powerful than violence, more sophisticated than any criminal organization. He had built the future of crime, and it looked like business. Meyer Lansky proved that in America, the most dangerous criminal isn't the one with the most guns, it's the one with an accountant.